everybody, and welcome back to The Lost Planeswalker. You're here with me, Jesse, The Lost Planeswalker, and today we're doing the deck everybody wants to know about, Endless Punishment Precon Upgrade Guide. Now, let's dive right in and look at the commanders, because we have two very fun ones. We have the big bad himself, Valgavoth, the Harrower of Souls. Valgavoth here, a big Elder Demon that's going to deal some damage, but the other card that is pretty good as well, we have the Lord of Pain, who actually, if you haven't read any of the story, is the leader of the Razorkin. He's kind of, you can see him here in the screens. He's not an actual being, I don't think. He kind of lives in the screens, going around the house, recruiting people. So, very, very cool. But Valgavoth here, Harrow of Souls, 2 black, red, legendary creature, Elder Demon with flying, ward, pay 2 life, and whenever an opponent loses life for the first time during each of their turns, put a +1/+1 counter on Valgavoth, Harrower of Souls, and draw a card. So essentially, we want to try and guarantee 3 card draws and 3 +1/+1 counters every turn with Valgavoth on the battlefield, slowly pinging down our opponents, whether we attack them or not, which is a very fun thing, because if another person is the arch enemy, you can kind of just slow roll your deck and reap the value of your opponents attacking your other opponents. But the Lord of Pain here, let's talk about him. 3 black, red, legendary creature, human assassin with menace. Your opponents can't gain life, and whenever a player casts their first spell each turn, choose another target player. The Lord of Pain deals damage equal to that spell's mana value to the chosen player. With these 2 on the battlefield, our co-commander here is going to guarantee that every time an opponent plays a spell, we're going to get a trigger off Valgavoth. But notably, I think what's really neat is it says when a player casts their first spell each turn. So that's not just whenever an opponent casts their first spell, it's players. So if you cast a spell and it's your turn or your next opponent's turn, both of those will trigger Lord of Pain in just thing or 16 if everybody casts something. So I think that Lord of Pain, very cool commander, not the main focus. Valgavoth is the main commander, and they really did a nice job with this deck. And I think that sometimes they go a little too indecisive when they build these decks as to what the actual play strategy is, but it's very clear here. You're dealing damage to your opponents, and you're putting things onto the board that's going to continually deal damage. And one of the things, now that we're going to move on to the new cards, non-bow effects, and then talk about cards to add, is I said non-bow effects. I'm not saying cards you should remove, because like if you watched the Death Toll deck, a lot of those creatures are very good, and I agree. I think most of the creatures they included here are very good. They just trigger on the wrong turn, in my opinion. And I think that there's a lot of extra benefit you can get from the cards I'm deciding to add. So let's dive right in and look at those new cards here with Barb Flayer Gremlin, Gleeful Arsonist, and Persistent Constrictor. Barb Flail Gremlin is obviously a joke to mana barbs if you don't know about this, but 3 in a red Gremlin with first strike haste, and whenever a player taps a land for mana, if this is tapped, that player adds 1 mana of that type the land produced, and then that land deals 1 damage to that player. So this is a mix of mana barbs and mana flare, I believe, simultaneously ramping our opponents and dealing damage to them, making it so, you know, they're tapping less lands to do what they want to do, but Magic players are greedy, so they're going to tap all their lands every turn, and Barb Flayer Gremlin is going to deal a ton to them. Gleeful Arsonist, 2 in a red creature, human wizard, with when an opponent casts a non-creature spell, this deals damage equal to its power to that player, and it has Undying, meaning that if it would die, it actually gets bigger, and it's going to deal more damage. And then Persistent Constrictor, very similarly, but the complete opposite. From Undying, we have Persist on this creature. At the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, they lose 1 life, and you put a -1/-1 counter on up to 1 target creature they control. This is going to bring down their biggest creatures, or hopefully just take out their smaller creatures in one go. The Persist trigger means it's going to be harder for this thing to be removed, so another great card that's going to guarantee we get triggers every turn. Sadistic Shell Game, Spiked Corridor, Tortured Pit, and Star Athlete are next. Sadistic Shell Game, 4 in a black sorcery, starting with the next opponent in turn order. Each player chooses a creature they don't control, destroy the chosen creatures. I'm not sure exactly why it starts with the next opponent, but my theory is that they're going to assess the same threat you're going to assess from one of their other opponents and destroy that creature, making them the bad guy for destroying the biggest thing, and you kind of come in at the end to clean up whatever's left, which I think is quite neat. I like these cards that have our opponents do stuff because, you know, it's either going to be, well, you destroyed my best thing, I'm going to destroy your best thing, or they're going to work together. So there's a real dynamic there I think is fun. Spiked Corridor and Tortured Pit is another enchantment room, but Spiked Corridor, 3 and a red. When you unlock this door, create 3 1/1 red devil creature tokens. With this creature dies, it deals 1 damage to any target. In Tortured Pit, 3 and a red. If a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage plus 2 instead. Both, I think, are pretty cool. Tortured Pit, obviously, is very powerful, especially in this deck, especially with our commander and the way that this deck is set up. So I think that's the side that's going to be chosen first, most of the times. Then Star Athlete. 1 red creature human warrior with menace. Whenever Star Athlete attacks, choose up to 1 target non-land permanent. Its controller may sacrifice it. If they don't, Star Athlete deals 5 damage to that player. It also can blitz out for 3 and a red. This is a very cool card. Making your opponents choose from a permanent they control or taking 5 damage is pretty sick. Also, if you blitz this out, even if it dies, you still get to sack it at the end of the turn and draw a card, so you're going to get benefit no matter what you do. Next up, we have Suspended Sentence, and lastly, Seance Board. Suspended Sentence, 3 and a black instant. Destroy target creature an opponent controls. That player loses 3 life. Exile Suspended Sentence with 3 time counters on it. This is just a kill spell that's going to come back again and again. Now, if you're lucky, you play this for the first time, you destroy something, you might get 1, maybe 2 additional uses before the game is over. So I think for 4 mana, that's pretty good. Or if it's turn 2, suspend this for 3 and, you know, potentially get 2 other kills for just 2 mana and some patience. And lastly, Seance Board, 2 generic artifact with Morbid. At the beginning of each end step, if a creature died this turn, put a soul counter on Seance Board. You can tap it to add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of soul counters on Seance Board. Spend this mana to cast only instant sorceries, demons, and spirit cards. This is one of the cards in this deck I think is going to go pretty expensive. Morbid triggers are pretty easy to hit in Commander. There's a lot of time to hit them. There's a lot of end steps. So this can get very big very quickly, letting you cast your instant sorceries for a lot. So I think that this is probably going to end up in a lot more red and blue decks than it is this deck when everything is said and done, but this is very cool. So next up, we're going to look at those non-bow effect cards, or cards I just think activate on the wrong turn and kind of don't benefit us as much as I would like. But before we do so, I would just like to say, please consider subscribing. It would mean the world to me. So thank you. So starting out, we have Blood Artist, Braid's Arisen Nightmare, and Enchanter's Bane. Blood Artist, right off the bat, great card for this deck, very powerful. It just has 1 toughness, and that's the killer here, is we have a lot of cards, especially a lot of cards I added, and there's a lot of cards in the deck that deal 1 damage to everything. And unfortunately, I think that that's where we kind of have our biggest issue, is if this had 1 more toughness, it would kind of be okay, but there is a lot of really good effects that deal 1 damage to each opponent and all creatures, and because this only has 1 toughness, it's just going to get killed right away, not allowing us to get as many triggers as we would like. Braid's Arisen Nightmare, a great card that lets you choose a artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker you control. You sacrifice it, then each opponent either loses life to keep it and let you draw a card, or they also sacrifice a permanent of the same type. Braids here just activates on your turn. So yes, it's a great card. You're going to get card draw off of it, but the effect you want is your opponent's taking that damage, and they're going to be taking it on your turn, which won't activate Valgavoth. And then Enchanter's Bane, 1 and a red enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, target enchantment deals damage equal to its converted mana cost to controller unless that player sacrifices it. It is your end step, not your opponent's end steps, which unfortunately mean they'll probably take the damage if it's good enough, but you're not going to be dealing damage on the turn you want. Very similarly, we have Grey Merchant of Asphodel, Massacre Girl, and Stormfist Crusader. Grey Merchant of Asphodel, 3 black creature zombie. Gary here, when he enters, is going to make each player lose X life, where X is your devotion to black, and you'll gain life equal to the life lost this way. Great card. Again, just doesn't trigger on our turns, but I mean, there is a lot of black cards in this deck, so Gary would be very powerful. Massacre Girl, great card that says when it enters the battlefield, each creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Whenever a creature dies this turn, each creature other than Massacre Girl gets -1/-1 until end of turn. So again, what you're kind of doing here is a looping effect, which is going to add a ton of -1/-1 counters onto all creatures, potentially wiping the entire board, except for Massacre Girl. I just think your board state in this deck is too important to get wiped by Massacre Girl, because you're going to have a lot of pieces that just want to sit on the battlefield, and that are just going to tick at your opponent slowly, killing them, draining them for life. And if you wipe the board, you just lost all that. And there's not like a mass reanimation spell in this deck to get that all back onto the battlefield. So I really think Massacre Girl hurts this deck for being in it. And then Stormfist Crusader, black and a red, creature, human knight with menace. At the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws a card and loses life. It's your upkeep again. If this was at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, they draw a card and lose a life. Well, there you go. But the last 3 cards to cut, we have Tectonic Giant, Theater of Horrors, and Vial Smasher the Fierce. Tectonic Giant, again, whenever it's targeted or attacks, it deals 3 damage to each opponent, or you can exile the top 2 cards of your library, choose one of them, and then you can cast that until the end of your next turn to play that card. It's just not going to do much, I think. I think our opponents are going to be smart enough not to target this. It's not really that big. Maybe it's going to get you some value, but this is probably going to die in a trade rather than, it being killed by a kill spell. So I don't think this is going to get a ton of value. Theater of Horrors is a 1 black-red enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top 2 cards of your library. During your turn, if an opponent lost life this turn, you may play lands and cast spells from one of the cards exiled with it, which I think is actually some really good advantage in Rakdos. This is a card I didn't know about, and I definitely put in some other decks for that reason. But for 3 and a red, this deals 1 damage to target opponent or Planeswalker. I don't want to pay 4 mana to do that. There's so many other better cards. There's 1 mana cards that deal damage to each opponent. So this is just, forget about it. That's not really good. And then Vial Smasher the Fierce. 1 black-red, legendary creature, Goblin Berserker. Whenever you cast your first spell each turn, this deals damage equal to that spell's converted mana cost to an opponent chosen at random. Vial Smasher here, great card. Just like Theater of Horrors and all of these cards, I think they're all really good. But I think that effect would work much better in a Lord of Pain focused deck versus this deck because it's your turn and we don't want to do damage on our turn. We want to save all that damage to get a bunch of more card value to slowly tick down our opponents with Vagavoth on all of our opponents' turns. Okay, let's now look at the cards I think you should add, and I'm going to start right out by looking at 3 particular cards because Vagavoth here is going to get big. And other than flying in Ward Pay 2 Life, which is really nothing in Commander, we want to protect it. So Champion's Helm, Mask of Avacyn, and Swiftfoot Boots are 3 great spells. All give hexproof, which is really important here. Champion's Helm is going to make it a little bigger, so is Mask of Avacyn, which I think is actually a little funny with a demon wearing this mask, but hey, it gets hexproof, so that's good. And of course, Swiftfoot Boots, great card to add to this deck. But with that out of the way, let's move on and look at some great cards that we're going to be able to use to ping our opponents, starting with Blasting Station, End the Festivities, and Goblin Bombardment. Blasting Station, a great staple card in a lot of combo decks, but you sack a creature. This deals 1 damage to target creature or player, and then when a creature comes into play, you may untap Blasting Station. Sacking one of our creatures to make sure that we hit a trigger with our commander is definitely worth doing. End the Festivities, single red sorcery. This deals 1 damage to each opponent and each creature or planeswalker they control. This is going to get rid of a bunch of little tokens. It's going to deal a little bit of damage. It'd be nicer if it was an instant, but it's going to help clear the boards a little bit and get that damage rolling. And then Goblin Bombardment, 1 in a red enchantment, sack a creature. This deals 1 damage to any target. Whether our opponents are casting a board wipe and we want to just ping them for a bunch, or we need to deal an additional damage to an opponent in order to grow our commander, draw some cards, Goblin Bombardment is there for you. Next up, we have Gut Shot, Mana Barbs, and Mount Doom. Gut Shot here can be paid for life instead of mana, which I think is great, and it can deal 1 damage to target creature or player, which is what we want to do. Mana Barbs, we already talked about that kind of with the Barb Flayer Gremlin, but whenever a player taps the land for mana, it's going to deal 1 damage to that player, accelerating the game, making it so the more mana you spend, the more damage you're taking. And then Mount Doom, I thought this was neat, but you can pay 1 life to add a black or a red, 1 black and a red, tap it to deal 1 damage to each opponent, which is great, or tap it for 5 black and a red, sack it, and a legendary artifact, choose up to 2 creatures, then destroy the rest. I honestly don't know if we have a legendary artifact in this deck. I mostly added it for that pinging, but that might be another strategy to look around. Next up, we have Obnixilis, the Hate Twisted, Pyrohemia, and Sophum Mayhem Domus. Obnixilis, the Hate Twisted, legendary planeswalker Nixilis from the War of the Spark set. When an opponent draws a card, this deals 1 damage to that player, which is perfect for us. And then -2, destroy target creature. Its controller draws 2 cards. We're going to be dealing damage, destroying creatures, making your opponents draw more, causing them to lose more life. Pyrohemia, staple card. For just 1 mana each of your opponent's turns, you can make sure you guarantee hit everything. In addition, if you don't have any creatures on the board, you can just put a ton of red mana into this, clearing the board. But if there are no creatures on the battlefield when Pyrohemia is out there, you have to sacrifice sacrifice it. So you got to balance that carefully. And then Sopham, Mayhem, Domus, 2 red, legendary creature, Phyrexian Horror. If a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. Doubling all our damage effects is very good. You can also pay 1 Phyrexian red mana to discard 2 cards and put an indestructible counter on Sopham, making it harder to remove. Moving on, we have Spear, Spewer, Stuffy Doll, and Thermo Alchemist. Spear, Spewer, single red, creature, goblin, warrior with defender, and you can tap it to deal 1 damage to each player. Great card. Similarly, Stuffy Doll, this is a little bit more expensive here with artifact creature construct with indestructible. As Stuffy Doll enters the battlefield, choose a player. When it is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to the chosen player, and you can tap it to deal 1 damage to itself. A great way to hit our triggers and make it a great blocker, causing our opponents to rethink what they're hitting. And then Thermo Alchemist, 1 and a red, creature, human, shaman with defender. This deals 1 damage to each opponent. When you cast an instant or sorcery, untap it. We certainly are going to be casting a bunch of instant sorceries, so a great card to have. Thornbite Staff, Underworld Dreams, and Walking Ballista are last here. Thornbite Staff, a great card. There are some other cards I think are better. This is kind of just a staple card that lets you equip this to a creature. You can pay 2 to have it deal 1 damage. If it ends up killing a creature, it gets untapped. And if you're playing any shamans, which Thermo Alchemist is, when they come into play, you can automatically attach Thornbite Staff to it. Underworld Dreams, simple, black enchantment that says when an opponent draws, this deals 1 damage to that player. And Walking Ballista, big creature. We can either spend our leftover mana to put more counters on this, and then whenever we want, we can remove any number of counters to deal 1 damage per counter to any target. A great card, and our last card we're going to talk about, and I would just like to say thank you so much for watching. What'd you think? I think that this deck is built pretty solid. I think that there's a lot of good cards. I think there was some non-bow effects I kind of talked about, but not saying they're not good or wouldn't work great in this deck. In addition, if you would please leave a comment down below what you think, share this video with a friend, leave a like and subscribe. That would mean the world to me, so thank you. And now today's Scryfall card of the day is Secrets of the Key. As Sigarda and Sorin battled, Arlen and Teferi recovered the key from the Markov Catacombs. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you later, Planeswalkers.